When I first glanced across the mysterious horizon of the land of shadow, I saw a world full of promise. What's beneath that tree? What's inside that fortress? What lays below, deep underground? A hell of a lot of recycled content, it turns out. Just a quick warning, this video is spoiler heavy and makes several allusions to other From Software titles, so if you haven't played those yet, I give you permission to skip the video. Let's begin with the many negatives. So my first gripe with this DLC is, as already stated, the sheer amount of recycled content. This was a big problem in the base game, and I'd really hoped that, really expected that, given the smaller size of the map in this DLC, there would be less recycling of content. I saw this DLC as a chance for From Software to address this issue with the Elden Ring franchise, an issue which doesn't really exist in any other From Software titles, or not nearly to the same extent anyway, certainly not to the extent where it's a constant issue. Relatively speaking, in Dark Souls, Demon Souls, etc., we see very little repetition of things like enemies and bosses. By repetition, I mean enemies being placed in more than a few distinct zones, or there being more than one variant of a particular boss. On the contrary, one of the things I love about the other From Software games is how you're always discovering lots of new enemies everywhere you go, rather than fighting the same ones over and over again. There are, of course, a few instances of recycling in other From Software titles, but it could hardly be called excessive. Elden Ring, on the other hand, has us fight something like 7 variants of the same basic premise of a dragon in the base game, all of which have the same wretched soundtrack. 7 variants, did I say? No, now make that at least 10 variants of essentially the same dragon. Yes, there are at least 3 more of this type of bog-standard dragon in Shadow of the Erdtree, 2 of which are encountered within about 5 minutes of each other, which is just ludicrous. These dragons are all practically the same. They lack the distinctive characteristics of dragons like Calamite, or Seath, or Medir, or even the ancient Wyvern, or even the ancient dragon from Dark Souls 2. They're not interesting dragons, they're filler dragons, all with the same wretched, hateful music which sounds like it was sampled and remixed from the Slave Nightingale boss fight in Dark Souls 3. A much, much, much better boss. Whenever I encounter one of these mediocre dragons and hear the soulless boss music, I can't help but compare Elden Ring to Dark Souls 3 and then think about just how inferior this game is. There are too many instances of this in Elden Ring where the music or the animations or the model or the concept of an enemy from an earlier From Software game is repurposed into something inferior, only to then be duplicated umpteen times throughout the game. And we see the same thing in Shadow of the Erdtree, except now it has yet another game to pillage from, the base game. Paying the princely sum of £35 for this much recycled content is a complete insult. Anyway, let's look at this from another angle before moving on to a different topic. The very worst thing about my experience with this DLC was how frequently it would subvert my expectations by presenting recycled content rather than unique content. Obviously, the more I played the game, the less of a surprise this became. But there were certain moments when, and certain areas where, I was really under the impression that I'd be met with something better than the lazy duplicate of a pre-existing enemy. I can give no better example of my dreams getting shattered than a particular encounter in the Church District. Keep in mind, this is a difficult to access, optional area. This is important. The reason it's important is because when I explore an area like this, I tend to have higher expectations about the quality of the content, as obviously such areas demand a considerable amount of effort to arrive at. And as a player, I expect to be rewarded for going the extra mile to access hidden areas. In my case, this involved spending literally about 3 hours running in circles before finally giving up and looking at a guide. I'll talk more about this later. Anyway, after much confusion, I finally arrive in this area, which is a flooded area that requires a little bit of platforming to navigate. I see an item in the distance, I go to explore the item when all of a sudden a rumbling alerts me to a shadow moving beneath the water. I love this moment. It was excellent because I wasn't expecting something like this. This was an example of the DLC subverting my expectations in a positive way, and in that sense it conforms to my expectations of From Software greatness. Hopefully that makes sense. Where am I going with this, you wonder? I introduce this example as being bad, but then say it's good. Well, the irony here is that this surprise encounter created further expectations. It made me wonder what this mysterious shadow would turn out to be, and had me thinking that it would probably be a cool boss I'd have to face once I'd drained the water. That was my immediate thought. It really got my imagination going, this shadow. Anyway, soon enough I did drain the water, allowing me to explore the bottom layer. I knew now that it wouldn't be long before I'd come face to face with whatever this shadow would turn out to be. Wow, what was it going to look like? What was it going to be? I thought to myself as I ventured closer and closer. I was genuinely excited at this point. So imagine how gutted I was when I discovered that this mysterious creature turned out to be recycled content from the base game, one of these tree monster mini-bosses. I died inside when I saw this. For me, it was the defining moment of the DLC. This encounter perfectly epitomises my core complaint about how Shadow of the Erdtree is ruined by content recycling. And the worst thing about all of this? Another one of these recycled monsters ambushes you about 30 seconds after you've beaten the first one. You're hyped up only to be let down, and then immediately let down again, as a constant deluge of regurgitated content bores you with every passing minute. A nice way to transition to the next topic is to make a quick nod to the means by which we arrive at the worst area in the game. I hope you're not bored of these grey catacombs yet, because yes, they're back again in the DLC. They've got some new enemies, mediocre enemies, and the same hateful grey walls. So, after travelling through the 99th catacomb, where do we end up? We end up in the Abyssal Woods, the worst area in the game, and, in my opinion, one of the very worst areas in From Software history. All the way down there with the frozen waste from that Dark Souls 2 DLC, I forget the name. And there are quite a lot of reasons why I hate this area. Firstly, there's the fact that you can't ride your horse. You have to traverse this entire, massive, boring area entirely on foot, which takes forever. This is compounded by the fact that you have to engage with stealth mechanics that are compulsory if you want to fully explore the area. These stealth mechanics slow down your progression even more. Exploring the majority of this area isn't rewarding anyway, as there's very little here that's worth seeing. Like many of the areas in the game, and I was going to make this point later but let's say it now, like many of the areas in this game, it's rather barren and comprised mainly of blank space with the odd bit of filler and the occasional nugget of gold. Yes, if you persist and if you're observant, you will eventually discover a good optional boss. But overall, this area is far too big and far too miserable to navigate. I mentioned how the stealth mechanics are compulsory if you want to fully explore the area. I'm not a big fan of forced stealth in general in non-stealth games, and it really didn't make much sense to me here. So the forced stealth is to make you feel disempowered, as they're aiming for a horror vibe here. You have to avoid these creatures as they're invulnerable. The thing is, I didn't so much feel disempowered as just irritated at the inconvenience. They could have achieved a solid horror atmosphere without the forced stealth mechanics. After all, Bloodborne manages to do so. It's not worth the hassle you're forced to endure by not being allowed to use your horse in this area, because that's obviously the reason that riding horse is forbidden here, to force you to engage with this rudimentary stealth mechanics. For me, the best thing about being in this area was reading the messages people had left in the grass while waiting my turn to be able to take my chance and escape the tedium. And the moment the messages become more entertaining than the actual content that they're referencing, you know things have taken a turn for the worst. I mentioned Bloodborne just now. Anyone wonder why Bloodborne in particular was just lingering in my mind? Take a guess. Of course, it's because the enemy I've been referring to is obviously a recycled version of a much better enemy from a much better game. In fact, one of the best Bloodborne enemies, which makes it one of the best enemies in From Software history, and in fact gaming history, as Bloodborne has the best enemy designs in the modern From Software canon and is one of the best games of all time. Of course, I'm talking about the Winter Lantern. Yes, singing walking brains are better than gurgling walking brains, I'm afraid. And what about that grapple attack with a tiny little mouse nibble at you? It's peak enemy design. If you're not going to exceed or even match the Winter Lantern, don't imitate it, because the enemy you create will just look lackluster by comparison. This is kind of how I feel about Elden Ring as a whole, by the way, and to be honest, it's an argument you could use for Dark Souls 2 and 3 as well, although I would say that Dark Souls 3 deserves a lot of respect. This topic is for another video entirely, a video I may well make. But back to my point, as well as sharing obvious visual similarities, mechanically the Winter Lanterns work in essentially the same way as whatever these enemies are, except you can actually fight them, which is even more tense and engaging because you have to rush to kill them before the frenzy bar fills up and they deal massive damage to you, or while having to evade their attacks. It makes for a tense, exciting battle, much more tense and exciting than crouching in the grass for 5 minutes. Anyway, in my opinion, they should have cut the size of this area down to roughly 10 to 20% and just gave you a straightforward path from the Catacombs exit to Midra's Manse. If you walked through this entire area but never found the subtle path to Midra's Manse, I pity you because you really suffered for nothing. Next thing I want to talk about is how the world is designed in a way that baits the player into wasting time. I'm sure literally every player experiences this in one form or another, but rather than go through every example, I'm going to focus on 2 specific things that ended up causing me, personally, to waste a substantial amount of time running in circles. The first example I alluded to earlier, and that's a difficulty you'll likely face if you want to organically discover the entrance to this area over here. So while I'm trying to get to this area, on a meta level I was thinking there's no way that an area that covers such a substantial area of the map could possibly be so unintuitive to access. From Software have made big areas like this tricky to access lots of times, but in such cases usually it's ambiguous as to whether or not the area is accessible anyway, and obvious that it isn't accessible via conventional means. Take Cainshurst Castle in Bloodborne for instance. It's obvious that, if reachable at all, it isn't going to be reachable on foot, so you're not baited into spending 3 hours trying to walk there. Anyway, this area looks like it could be accessible if you just circle around, like a lot of other places are. But no, it will always be just out of reach, and eventually you'll realise that getting here isn't going to be straightforward. So then, if you've explored enough, you'll begin to wonder whether it's accessed via a dungeon, as a few of the dungeons are bridges between different mainland areas. I've already given one example earlier in the video. But anyway, no, that's not how you get here either. This area is an anomaly. It's accessed via a tiny hole in the ground, found among some ruins. Ruins that, if you're like me, you briefly explored before assuming that they were just more filler, as there's so much filler in this DLC. Anyway, finding this hole is like finding a needle in a haystack. It's absolutely ridiculous. It wouldn't be so annoying if the area it leads to didn't contain such a substantial landmass, but not being able to find the entrance to this area when it comprises, I don't know, about 10% of the entire world map is extremely frustrating. It gives you a constant sense of FOMO. Worse yet, for anyone who did just give up after not being able to find this hole, they'll have missed out on 3 out of 10 of the major bosses in the game. In other words, the bosses are actually worth seeing. Oh, and they'll have missed out on the other half of one of the better areas in the game, the Specimen Storehouse, which is still a mediocre area by From Software standards, but good for this DLC. Being able to see this massive zone on the map, just out of reach, is immensely frustrating, especially as there's a massive cathedral here that's obviously meant to be a major landmark to bait the player to the area. This landmass was as much a source of irritation as a source of intrigue for me. throughout the 20 or so hours I spent playing the game and gazing at the cathedral in the distance, before I eventually threw in the towel and googled how to find the correct route in. I said I'd give 2 examples. So the next example is how basically if you happen to explore the upper layers of this area in the northwest before you've explored what turns out to be the lower layers, you will be continuously tormented by a tiny icon on the map screen among the greyed out space. So this icon indicates that there's a map fragment there that you can obtain, and it will fill in. You know how it works. The issue is that despite looking like the map fragment could be in this area, and definitely seeming like it should be in this area from a design perspective, the map for this zone is actually located in the lower layer, which isn't accessible from up here. Running around this area, you'll see messages all over the place where, funnily enough, people are frustrated at the fact that they can't find the map fragment for the area they're in. I was one of these people. I spent a long time looking for this map before assuming that it must have been placed on a lower level, as an example of world-class Miyazaki trolling rivaling the Dark Souls 1 pendant. Personally, I found this annoying as it ended up baiting me to repeatedly explore the entirety of this mediocre space that's filled with copy-pasted enemies from earlier in the game. I was particularly disgusted when, in the course of searching for the map, I happened upon a variant, in other words, a recycled version of the Dancing Lion boss I'd encountered much earlier. This variant is, in addition to being a variant and a source of disgust to me on that basis alone, also incredibly cheesy, but that's a point for later. So, I just want to expand on something I said earlier, and that's how a lot of the areas in the game turn out to be fairly barren and just mediocre. So, the more I played this game, the more I was struck by how often you'll see an area in the distance which looks promising, and that when you go and visit and arrive there, you realise that it's just a lot of blank space and not much else. This is especially frustrating because, as I mentioned a few times in this video, it's easy to get hyped when you see how good some stuff looks from a distance, which means the disappointment is all the greater when it turns out to be trash. I felt this disappointment acutely in this first Fingers area, where after following the quest and ringing the bell, all I got was an item and not access to a new area or a cool boss or something of interest. The boss comes much later in a separate area, but this area and the duplicate area in the north of the map are a complete letdown. This northeastern area is essentially the same blank space, copy-pasted with only minimal differences. Honestly, I felt like Miyazaki was giving me the finger 1,000 times as I rode back through this area, and another 1,000 times as I rode through its duplicate 10 hours later. Thanks, Miyazaki. Okay, now let's talk about difficulty. Simply put, the difficulty in this DLC is insane. And I'm saying that as someone who has beat every From Software game, including Sekiro. In my opinion, 2 of the bosses in this game are unreasonably difficult. These bosses are, of course, Bow the Dread. What the fuck was that? And the final boss. Bow the Dread is optional, so you don't have to put yourself through it if you don't want to. I did, and to be honest, I wish I hadn't, because it was immensely frustrating. I will say that I think Baal is slightly easier than the final boss overall, but anyway, these bosses are hard, but are they fair? I don't think so. These bosses share 2 extremely annoying traits which make them painful to fight. The first being that when they reach their second phase, you rarely end up getting a chance to actually attack them, as they're always either out of reach or constantly attacking. The other thing is, in their second phases, these bosses have insane AoE attacks and will often immediately follow up on one attack with a second attack that deals AoE damage. So if you try and dodge one attack, you'll have to evade the AoE follow-up as well, which is extremely hard to do. There are a few other annoying things about the final boss's second phase specifically, one of which being the holy damage that will gradually chip away at you if, like me, you used a shield. I hadn't used a shield since I first played Dark Souls 1 about 10 years ago, but this DLC necessitated it. The most hateful thing of all about the final boss, however, is its incredibly cheap surprise attack that it pulls after reaching about 25% health, which is almost guaranteed to catch you off guard. Suddenly, the boss will disappear, and if you're like me, you'll be incredibly confused and then incredibly angry when you'll suddenly find yourself dead in a single shot after the boss crashes down from the skies like a meteor. This attack is the single cheesiest attack in Soulsborne history. Well, this nonsense led me to experimenting with cheese making of my own, which was when I eventually realised that the Omen Killer Cleaver, which already deals bleed damage, can be given a weapon art which adds frostbite damage, so then me and a Mimic tier were finally able to succeed in hemorrhaging and frostbiting this boss to death. And I was ecstatic to know that I was done with the DLC once and for all, as there was no way I could endure fighting this boss ever again. Just as a side note, this isn't the only cheapness you'll come across. As I mentioned, the Dancing Lion duplicate has a pretty annoying trick to catch you off guard the first time you fight it, where out of nowhere it will summon a pack of basilisks to bite your ankles and breathe curse at you. Honestly, how cheesy can you get? This DLC really does scream hard for the sake of hard, or unfair for the sake of hard. And before I move on, obligatory mention of recycling. The final boss is of course adapted from the concept of the Twin Princes boss fight in DS3, where partway through the fight a second character with a holy affinity climbs atop the boss's shoulders and grants them new attacks. There's enough of a difference here though, and there are some cool things about the design of this boss despite how cheesy it is. I'll discuss this briefly in the positives section. As for Radagon himself, obviously, he is a recycled boss model, which lowers the quality of the fight overall in my eyes, despite the fact that I think that Mikola is a cool character. As for conceptual recycling, that I've mentioned a few times before, some of you are probably thinking that Dark Souls 3 does this a lot, which it does, but for the most part, Dark Souls 3 does it well and legitimately, which is something I am going to cover in a subsequent video. Now let's move on to the positives. I think that some of the unique bosses are good from a visual design perspective. Obviously, I'm not talking about the many trash filler bosses here. I'm talking about bosses like Midra and Mesmer, etc. The Remembrance dropping bosses specifically. They just look cool. It speaks for itself, really. Same thing goes for the NPC designs. They're also good. Particularly, I love the design of both Saint Trina and Arnsbark. They're really cool. This all ties into a bigger overarching positive of this game, and that's how aesthetically pleasing it is. The environments, again, just speak for themselves. From Software have successfully crafted a really intriguing looking world which, as I said, only makes it all the more disappointing to explore when you find it's full of recycled rubbish. A small thing I really like about the Mikola boss fight is the attack he does where he speaks a line of dialogue. I absolutely detest the "I will destroy thee" monologues a lot of bosses give in Elden Ring, so it's nice here to see something different. More significantly, it's clever that the kind tone of Mikola's words, and you could say the charming nature of Mikola's words, correlate with the fact that the attack itself inflicts a charmed debuff, where if you're hit by the same debuff twice in a row, your character visibly pledges himself to Mikola, resulting in an instant defeat. Your character is sort of seduced. This is an example of Miyazaki when he's actually inspired, I think, rather than just churning out content to fill space, because this is very elegant game design where narrative and mechanics are perfectly in sync, and I think it deserves a mention even though it's only a relatively tiny positive in the grand scheme. So there are both positive and negative aspects to the item distribution in this game. Negatives are the fact that you'll often plunder an area only to be disappointed with cookbooks and grave glove war, I think they're called, or whatever, which you don't really need at this point in the game. But the good thing is that there are actually a reasonable amount of decent and worthwhile viable items to discover hidden among all the trash, which is quite impressive considering the sheer amount of items that were already in the base game. Anyway, that's pretty much it for positives, sadly. Level design is okay in some places, but nothing exceptional. This DLC continues a trend of having inferior level design post Stormveil Castle. In fact, I'd argue that everything in Elden Ring goes downhill after you finish Stormveil Castle. In Stormveil Castle, it's still early enough for you to be blissfully ignorant of the sheer extent of the dreaded copy-paste. Obviously assuming that Stormveil Castle was the first Legacy dungeon you tackled. I talked about my anticlimactic encounter with the diseased tree mini-boss as being the lowest point of the DLC, and it's such a poetically ironic contrast to the first encounter I had with this enemy in Stormveil Castle. Because back then, when it was still fresh and new, this enemy completely blew my mind. Anyway, let's wrap this up. How bad is this DLC compared to other From Software DLCs? Although it's pretty bad, personally, I don't think it's quite as terrible as Ashes of Ariandel, an absolutely abysmal DLC by any standard. Why I consider Ashes of Ariandel to be so bad is another video entirely, which I may well do at some point, if anyone cares, in 2024. I mentioned the price of Shadow of the Erdtree earlier in the video, £35. Obviously this is far too expensive considering the overall quality of the DLC. £35 now would be about £30 back in 2016 when Dark Souls 3 was released. Dark Souls 3 cost around £40 upon release, just think about that. This all seems more and more absurd the more you think about the relative cost of other Souls games, either back when they were released or especially now when they're always on discount. Put it this way, if the only From Software game you've played is the Elden Ring base game, and for some reason you're watching this spoiler-heavy review, don't bother forking out £35 for this trash. Instead, buy a bunch of the other superior From Software games. Because, at the end of the day, Elden Ring is just a bloated, soulless, cringe Dark Souls 3 anyway, and Shadow of the Erdtree is just more of the same.